human beings roughly 3 generations to adapt to new technology. But there wasn't a lot of technology. We were 98% of the employment force, the workforce was working in agriculture. And every once in a while, there'd be some innovations around the types of tools we would use, and we did the best we could. But every 3 generations is what it took to adapt new technology. And around the end of the 18th century, and we'll talk about industrial revolutions in just a second, things started to change with steam. As steam was introduced, we began to more quickly adapt to new technology. Today, it requires us roughly 5 to 7 years as human beings to adapt to new technology. The problem is that technology has been on an exponential curve for those many years, at least the last couple of 100 years since steam was introduced. And in 2007, these lines intersected, and it's created this significant gap. So if every 2 to 3 years, which has been the pace the last 10 years or so, there are new technologies, and it takes us 5 to 7 years. What's been created is this gap where we can't make business decisions fast enough to react to the technology and maximize the opportunity that the technology represents. We don't legislate fast enough. We can't educate fast enough. I want to talk to you a little bit about some of the trends that I'm seeing as it relates to how that's evolving, how that's changing just in this region and in Wisconsin in particular. What I just put up were some additional information around the computing waves that have occurred in the 50s and 60s. Mainframe computing came to be, and in 1968 or so, that was sort of the golden age of mainframes. And it was primarily focused on the financial centers because it was the large financials who were buying mainframe compute. Around that time frame, maybe a little bit earlier than that, in the early 60s, a gigabyte of storage cost $10 million, right? 1 gig. And over that time, since that period, not just storage, but connectivity, bandwidth, computing power. These technologies have not only massively improved by a factor of billions, but they've also been demonetized. And so this extreme computing power has enabled converging technologies to occur. And you can see the other computing waves, and 1992 is the 3rd computing wave, and that's really the rise of Silicon Valley and Microsoft, which had been going on. And then 2007 is, so many things happened in 2007, the iPhone famously, but so many technologies that were cloud related, that relied on public cloud, relied on 4G, which was just after that. But we are here right now, and by 2023, what futurists talk about is $1,000 of compute will you by the processing power of a human brain, and by 2039, the human race. So at this point, the exponents, the verticality to the path that technology is so significant that it's just hard to really fully grasp and formulate the right response. As business owners, as individuals, as consumers, as customers in B2B environments, as regions, et cetera. We'll talk about some of those examples. This is a great example of a statistic that it's a fun one. It's, the first year of the Fortune 500 was in 1955, and 60 years later, in 2015, 440 of those 500 companies in that first Fortune 500 had ceased to exist. And the System 1 response is, but there's still a Fortune 500, so that's okay. Change happens over a period of time like 6 decades, and new companies come in and everything remains stable. And what I would suggest is that what we're up against now is a little different. It's closer to what's happened with dairy farming in Wisconsin since 1969. In 1969, there were 64,875 dairy farms in Wisconsin. Today there are 7,800. We've lost 40% of those farms in the last 10 years, 25% of the farms in the last 5 years. In 2018, we were 700 of the 3,000 dairy farms that ceased to exist were in Wisconsin. This year, we lost 3 a day in the month of April. Okay, so the acceleration of small family-owned businesses in this particular industry is accelerating, and it is causing heartache, and you can read about it every week in the Journal Sentinel, right? And what I'm suggesting is that there are additional changes coming that it won't be where it won't be restricted to just one industry like dairy farming, where a System 1 response might be, that makes sense. Wisconsin produces more dairy than we ever have. But rather, this will impact every business in every industry. It already is. This is not about the future. This is about how to catch up with what has been going on the last 5 years. But John Chambers, who's the executive chairman at Cisco, talks about at least 40%. My number in Wisconsin for manufacturing, where I spend a significant amount of time, is the same 40%. Just to bring this home, when you think about 40%, it's not the largest companies in the world that will survive. It's the most adaptive. So when you think about 40% attrition and you apply that just to the Fortune 500 in Wisconsin, it's these 9 companies. And I would ask you to just think to yourself for a moment, which of these 3 or 4 companies will cease to exist by 2030? Any thoughts? Sorry? Harley. Kohl's. What's interesting about every one of the companies on the board is if you take a look at them, you could make an argument either way, right? Harley's making significant investments in Livewire, their electric series. They've diversified their income portfolio, their revenue portfolio. They've opened an office and are recruiting engineers out in Silicon Valley. They're making these types of moves in a future-proofing, self-preservation mode, right? Kohl's has done the same thing with their Silicon Valley office. Manpower Group, the world is going to need talent more than ever before. American Family is coming to Milwaukee. They're the new sponsor for the Brewers Stadium, for replacing Miller Park. We Energies, WEC. You can argue either side of all of these, and it's difficult to understand who's making the right decisions on time. In Wisconsin, just for a moment, how many of you are either manufacturers yourselves or serve the manufacturing industry? So in Wisconsin, there are roughly 9,200 manufacturers. Roughly 10% of them produce products. They are discrete manufacturers that make things that go to market. The other 90% make components that supply those products and other products around the world. Okay, so it's 476,000 employees in the workforce. That's roughly 1 out of 6 in Wisconsin, and it is 18% of the state's GDP. That's the importance of this particular industry here, and I believe that the 40% number holds true, and now we're not talking about 3 or 4 businesses, we're talking about 3,000 or 4,000 businesses. Now, it's important to note that business outcomes will vary more widely than ever before over the next decade, and so while there is significant risk on one end of the spectrum, the other end of the spectrum is there are tremendous opportunities for businesses who are able to get out in front. You'll probably never outpace technology, but to figure out how to leverage technology and how to reimagine your particular business, how to reimagine the way you monetize your products and services today, et cetera. And we're going to spend some time on that. Like John Chambers said around being conservative, this is a conservative figure. I started out at 30%. I changed it to 40% after a phone conference where I shouldn't have said what I said about 30%, and it was 20 seconds of really uncomfortable silence on the call with a bunch of people in Madison. And then the next words were 20 seconds later were, "We think you're a little light." And they talked me into 40%, and now I sometimes go to manufacturing conferences, and I'm in the audience, and there are slides that look like this one, except it says Todd McLees predicts, which is not the goal. That's never comfortable. But I've also been in conversations where people from manufacturing productivity groups will say, Todd and I agree that 40 to 50% of manufacturers, and I always say, no, my ceiling is 40. We're talking about 3,700 companies, and that's a significant amount of disruption, and there's a lot of thoughts going through your mind right now about why it's okay, right? Like, there are a lot of companies that will be sold in the next 10 years. Do the math on 3,700. It's 1 a day for 10 years. If every day there's a manufacturer that ceases to exist for whatever reason, whether it's M&A, whether it's closing up shop, whether it's asset sale, when you're talking about 3,700 companies here, and in just the 3-state region of Wisconsin, Illinois, and Indiana, roughly 11,500 businesses. First of all, it's really important to have everything in order to be prepared to sell. So if you're on a 1, 3, 5-year horizon, there are things that you need to be paying attention to that you've never had to before, like data analytics. If I'm selling my manufacturing company 12 months from now, 24 months from now, maybe I'm tempted to not make the significant investments required or less than significant investments required to add a layer of advanced data analytics or information management to my business so that I've got operating data. But it is all that line item of do they have manufacturing execution system data is already a discount item from acquiring companies. So if those things are, if certain elements are not in place, like cybersecurity and simple dashboards and so forth, there are discounts already being taken on exit because of those reasons. There are 8 forces. I believe they converge. There's a lot of overlap in these, but certainly businesses will be sold because they're multi-generational businesses without a succession plan in place. Some simple mindset challenges like this is what's always worked, and there's really no reason to change. Of course, the talent gap, which we'll spend some time on. Changing market dynamics, like if you serve the automobile industry, for instance, and electric vehicles don't scare you too much, but autonomous vehicles do, you know, significant issues. Logistics, as we reach for autonomous in 10 or 20 years, significant issues. Changing customer requirements might be if I have a customer who requires particular data, particular levels of transparency that we've never had to exchange data before, and I don't have a way to acquire that data, or it becomes an issue. Emerging technologies we're going to spend a bunch of time on, and then of course big issues, big picture issues. So I was using a framework of internal, external, and big picture. Digital globalization, this is not cargo ships with big containers. This is around digital skill sets, and then that feeds right into urbanization and population growth. You know, when you look at another exponential curve here is population growth, you'll find that in the next 50 years, none of the top 20 cities in the world will be in either North America or in Europe. They will all be in Southeast Asia, not necessarily China, and the African continent. There are some cities in Africa, on the African continent today, that are 7 or 8 million people that are expected to be 77 to 80 million people by the turn of the next century. And so that's twice the size. Their birth rates are 4% in some areas. That's twice the size of today's largest most populated areas like Tokyo and Sao Paulo and so forth. What's really hard about this data is that while there is significant growth, in fact, more food has to be produced in the next 50 years than in the last 10,000 years combined to feed this population. But you can see the birth rate decline and what impact that will have in the near term on folks future-proofing themselves, because in the next 10 years, what we're facing in the US is 5 million more people leaving the workforce than entering the workforce just because of demographics and birth rates that are 18 and 20 years ago. So let's talk about industrial revolutions and then focus on the fourth one, which is what we're living in right now. The first thing you should notice here is that these time frames condense. Between the first industrial revolution, which was steam, you know, steam power, 1698 was the first patent. The British Empire released the patents and allowed the intellectual property to make its way around the world about 60 years later. And by around 1800, factories were being powered, and it caused a tremendous amount of change. It did really good things, like it helped solve poverty in the industrialized nations. It caused urbanization to occur. people moved to cities and the intellectual eras began. There were also really big challenges, like, for instance, how many of you have heard the term Luddite? Right? Well, that's from a Scottish guy named Ned Ludd, who was really upset about the fact that the artisan workers, who were the loomers at the time, working in textile mills, were being replaced by unskilled workers from the agricultural industry because the power loom came to be. And in every industrial revolution, there's been fear about human beings being replaced by electrification and the assembly line, by computing and robotics, by AI, so forth, okay? In the second industrial revolution, I think there are a lot of lessons to be learned. So that's electrification. It's really around 1900, the factories began to move from steam power to electric power, and assembly lines came to be because you could localize the power. And many factories electrified. Within a 10-year period, half the factories had electrified. Within a 20-year period, more than 90% of the factories had electrified, and they all got, most of them got, incremental gains because of the tremendous efficiencies of electricity versus steam. But there were only several examples, Ford being one of them, where work processes were reorganized. We're not talking about business process engineering here, we're talking about reimagination. And what Ford did with the automobile, and these are adoption curves of the second industrial revolution technologies. You can see the telephone and electricity in the automobile. What Ford did was he reimagined process. He was not the first with an assembly line. That was actually the meat processing plants. Oldsmobile was first in the automobile industry. But he made sure that they actually reorganized the work as well. And what happened was the price of the Model T went from $840 to $250 in about a 5-year period. And at the same time, automobile adoption was moving up significantly, and their market share, because there were hundreds of manufacturers to begin with, automobile manufacturers, there were 350 or something like that in the early 20th century, their market share went from 9% to 48% globally in a 5-year period. So it was that sort of explosive growth that was really brought to Ford because of the reimagining of the assembly process and the 75 roughly % reduction in prices. The other thing that process did was it was adopted by radio and refrigeration and television factories. It created the middle class because he also believed in a fair living wage. It gave people disposable income so they could afford these sorts of then luxury items. What it took before 1930 to refrigerate, what it took before the washing machine to clean clothes was significant. And much of that was brought through by these process reimaginations and this concept from Ford. As it related to automobiles, this is one of my favorite pictures that actually Eric shared with me the first time I saw it. In 1900, this is a picture of Easter morning on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan, and all you see almost everywhere are horse carriages. But at the bottom of the screen where the red circle is about to pop up, you'll see the one innovator in the crowd who's driving an automobile that day. And just 13 years later, when you think about the speed of change today, this is Fifth Avenue on Easter morning, and you'll only find, I think I found a second horse carriage after doing this presentation so many times. But it's automobiles throughout. And this is just a 13-year gap. Okay, so rapid adoption at that point in time, and today we put it to shame. And it was all because Ford believed that each person should do one simple task and add these tremendous efficiencies to the process. And it wasn't simple incremental change. And the same temptation today to add AI, to add automation, to add advanced data analytics and the other Industry 4.0 technologies, IoT, et cetera, we have got to be wary of the temptation to think incrementally. The most aggressive gains, the best opportunities are reserved for the companies and the individuals who can think laterally and in a perpendicular way and reimagine process, as opposed to automating or electrifying an existing process. So it's only 12:30. If it were after 3 o'clock, we could probably play a drinking game, and the number of times here forward that you hear the words either exponential or ecosystem, we would all have a pretty good time. So this, again, is World Economic Forum talking about the exponential change, and you saw an example of that on the AstroTeller slide. It's really these 12 technologies, along with that extreme computing power of storage, processing, and bandwidth, along with these digital and physical world technologies. And the thing is, it's not just one of these technologies. You know, depending on who you're talking to, sometimes it's about robotics, sometimes it's about AI, et cetera. But this is really about today. It's about the convergence of technologies. If I'm working in an industrial setting, for instance, and I want to add advanced data analytics so that I can automate particular work cells, I might need next-gen compute because we're the digital era, we're on our way out, and now we're headed towards quantum compute. I would want sensors in place. I'm going to use AI. I'm going to use chatbots, NLP. I'll use advanced data analytics and data visualization. I will use robotics and RPA, and I will use IoT. And together, it's those technologies, the convergence of, what is that, 7 technologies of the 12 on the previous, all enabled by cloud and extreme compute power, but also converged and combined here. Now, you'll hear me say this later on. Technologies converged. This is where value is. This is where business value exists. People convene. What we have to do is figure out how to converge in order to keep pace, in order to add enough value. How many of you are familiar with Lighthouse Manufacturing as a term? So Lighthouse Manufacturing is McKinsey and World Economic Forum designation. There are 16 facilities in the world. There are certainly others, like Under Armour in Maryland have a lighthouse. They've declared a lighthouse facility. These are the 16 that McKinsey and WEF declared as lighthouse. This is rapid adoption and wide adoption of the technologies on that previous slide, those 12 technologies. It is taking people out of the mix. That's why on this dashboard you will find no safety metrics, because it's about productivity without people, okay? But Foxconn Industrial Internet is one of the 16 in their factory in China, and they're building a lighthouse facility in Racine around these types of technologies, around factory automation, and that particular factory will be an SMT line, a surface mount technology line, so printed circuit boards and the like. The only other one in the US is in Chicago. It's Fast Radius along with UPS, and it is a large 3D printing additive manufacturing facility. Everybody else, it's the best names in manufacturing in Europe and Asia. And you can see the metrics. This is the range achieved on the 11 key metrics. So one of my favorite anecdotes about the world that I work in every day is that you know, as it relates to data analytics, it's oftentimes quite intimidating to figure out what metrics matter to add efficiency to your business. And so we're in the habit of, even though I am a consultant, I will say instead of killing all the lawyers, which is just quoting Shakespeare, we should kill all the consultants, because our job typically is to maximize the revenue of every engagement, to include billable hours to help people understand what are the key metrics for their business. We're going to talk about capability maturity in just a little bit. I want you to just think about these 11 items and imagine for a moment, even if you're too young to do so, that it's 1979 instead of 2019. It's 40 years ago. This would be a laminated sheet in a 3-ring binder. We have, the consulting industry is a self-perpetuating one. And there are so many incredible inefficiencies in the way we buy and sell today and add mystery to environments. I'm not suggesting that if we all each owned businesses that we would put equal weight on each of these metrics and we could prioritize accordingly. What I am saying is this is just one of the many examples where the 11 key metrics have been standardized and declared. And underneath them, there are several more. And then in your own business, you might prioritize those metrics differently. But there is no mystery, and there should be no billable time at $1,000 an hour to understand what those 10 metrics are, or 11 in this case. those first 10, the next 20. There are certain things in a digital world where we're dealing with disruption, certain things that we are used to turning into revenue events need to be democratized so we can go faster. There is actually a model where companies can work together to build these types of dashboards and go very quickly, and I'll show you that in just a little bit. Because it doesn't have to be hard. There's a lot more technology coming. It's going to be so overwhelming. You know, you can take a look at the Gartner hype curve on hype cycle, and these exist for, this happens to be one that's focused on manufacturing, but these exist for many verticals. There are so many new technologies coming. In fact, Ray Kurzweil, who, for those of you who are familiar with Singularity University, or Ray is the director of engineering at Google, he talked about 20,000 years of progress in this century. So think about that last slide where the second industrial revolution technologies, those market adoption lines. These are some of the fourth industrial revolution lines. The last one that just went up here is the smartphone. It took the telephone 76 years to be adopted by mainstream market. It took the smartphone 9 years, okay? So there's much greater verticality to these lines. But to just look at what 1,000 years of innovation looks like, not the 20,000, it looks like this. So in the 20th century, there were 20 major technologies. You saw the first several from the beginning of the century. And so it's about every 5 years there was a major life-changing innovation that occurred. And in this century, his prediction is every 9 days. This prediction is every 6 months. But you can see this tremendous difference, and some of this might look fun and like a rainbow, but really what is concerning the analysts, like one of my friends who runs digital thread at Deloitte, his comment to me was, this is going to cause significant paralysis. Because if in my business I've got $150,000 of discretionary margin to re-employ in the business, to move my business forward, when do I make that investment when the next new technology is 9 days away or 180 days away? We all already know what buying and selling cycles look like when technology is a couple years away, right? So the major issue here, as Eric pointed out in his introduction, is paralysis. And it may not be by analysis. It may just be, well, let's wait to see what comes in next week or next month or 6 months from now. And so the way we buy and sell is not going to work. The way we get the work done is too inefficient based on what's coming. Okay? And again, that was just 5% of what the actual prediction is by technologists. So let's talk about workforce, because it's obviously a significant issue. The talent gap's a burning issue. This is the chart I was alluding to earlier, where we will lose 500,000 more people from the workforce every year for the next 10 years on average versus the number of people joining the workforce. So you're already starting to see leveraging seniors who are going to hang on for another few years. They're going to provide mentoring. They'll provide institutional knowledge transfer. They will work 15 hours a week. We've got the gig economy, 55% of the workforce, et cetera. But every tightening of the workforce that you're feeling right now is only going to get more complicated. In Wisconsin, in the next 8 to 10 years, I believe it's roughly a 250,000 person gap. It's just people, just bodies rather, not having anything to do with the other complexities. So it's more than 5 million people in the next 10 years. There's another major issue, which is we're back to the levels of 1978, where workforce participation is right at around 63%. So even though we hear numbers like 3.2% unemployment or 2.8% in certain industries in Wisconsin, just know that oftentimes those metrics don't take into account that only 5 out of 8 people in the region that are of working age are actually in the workforce. Okay, so you've got to look a layer deep on those statistics. In this particular industry of manufacturing, the global expectation, according to Korn Ferry, is that the number of jobs that are not filled over the next 10 years will go 4x, from 2 million to 8 million. And in the US, an important statistic is that they expect 4.6 million jobs, and this is just one industry, to be created and only 2.2 of them to be filled. So 53 out of every 100 jobs. Now, what's lost there is productivity. So let's talk about workforce of the future. You might view it something like this. You might view it where the robot's holding somebody by their head instead. If you're afraid as to whether or not your job will be replaced, you can go to willrobotstakemyjob.com and enter your title, and it will tell you to what predictability level your job will go away in the near term. So taxi drivers and chauffeurs, it's 89% likely in the next decade. But you can enter any role into there. A central challenge is not actually about pure replacement of people. The central challenge is about displacement of part of the job. So as redundant, repetitive, manual tasks are replaced, whether those be physical or mental tasks, we're going to have to figure out how to reshape roles on an ongoing basis. So that paralysis in terms of technology adoption is also going to apply to everybody's job in here, in every business. My job, your job, et cetera. This is McKinsey talking about job growth, and you can take a look at Wisconsin and see the sorts of job growth, and you can see the maximum is 15%, and if it's white, it's 0 or less than 0. And then if you look at displacement, you can see a significant amount of displacement, primarily because of agriculture and manufacturing in the Wisconsin region. By the way, those statistics go from 18 to 33%, not 0, right? So even the lighter shaded areas, we're talking about 1 out of 6 jobs, 1 out of 5 jobs. So almost everybody will be impacted throughout the world in the next 10 years. McKinsey talks about half the jobs could be, of activities currently are technically automatable by technologies that are currently demonstrable today, right? They can be demonstrated today. This is not about new technology. This is just about adoption of technology. 6 out of 10 occupations in the world can be automated to greater than 30%. And this is the most dystopian view of it, but McKinsey talks about 800 million people being displaced because of adoption in the next 10 years. So let's talk about that for a second. There are 3.2 billion people in the workforce, 3.3 globally. This is 1 out of 4 workers being displaced because of technology in the next 10 years and automation in the next 10 years. And again, this could just be AI, accountants, stockbrokers. If you look at stockbrokers, there's already been a 33% reduction of people in the investment bankers in New York, et cetera, and it's because they're being replaced by algorithms and AIs, not because a robot or android, a droid is sitting there. So 800 million people, and 375 million of those 800 million will be displaced to the point where they will have to change job categories. So we're talking about a significant amount of change. Is anybody significantly scared yet? So we can move on to the solution. This is the biggest statistic, and if you take one statistic away, World Economic Forum last fall, about a year ago to this month, said that more than half the workforce, 54%, need to be significantly reskilled, upskilled, or new skilled. The umbrella term is right skilled by 2022, and that was a year ago. And so the prescription was 200 hours per year per employee, or 800 hours over a 4-year period of time, but now there are only 3 years. How many of you in your business have a significant program in place where you are already contemplating career pathways for your team and you have the training in place to reskill or upskill individuals for their next role or the next 2 roles? How many of you already have that in place today? A handful. Okay. And so the most significant challenge in front of us today is not the complete displacement of workers, but the evolution of every role in every business, and about 6 hands went up when asked if there was something in place already. When Accenture breaks down every role, they talk about 3 different categories. That which is uniquely human, that which can be augmented, and that can be automated. And this is a little bit of an eye chart, but if you just pay attention to the gray bars and recognize that in some cases, gray and blue rather, in some cases, many cases, more than 90% of the role can be augmented using intelligent technologies or robotics, or it can be completely automated. And so whether it's 30% of somebody's role or 90% of somebody's role, job descriptions, roles, responsibilities, the way that we gauge performance, the work that we are asking people to do is going to change significantly. So that was a lot of information, and we have some challenges as human beings to figure out how to work through this over the next 10 years, but it really doesn't have to be as difficult as we typically make it. Part of this is that when we think about particular processes, when we think about competitive paradigms, we think in a very linear way. And the challenge is to go back and help your organization rethink, reimagine the way that we go to market, the way that we decide to compete, the way we decide to implement. The analogy would be, in every smart connected vehicle, approximately 4 terabytes of data gets produced every hour, every operating hour. And so there are roughly 500,000 Teslas on the road today. And so every day, Tesla has access to 2 million terabytes of data using not all of the data by any stretch, but using primarily these 5 points of telemetry to improve the autonomous driving system in their cars. And when they do that, it takes into account, if we're all Tesla owners, it takes into account the way all of us drive. So my car gets smarter because of the way all of you drive, and that's true for every one of us. And that's exponential, right? The entire fleet, every few weeks when they do a software upgrade, the entire fleet benefits. And so it looks something like this, right? This is 1,000 cars per dot. It's 500,000 cars. And you've got software upgrades that impact everybody, and that's exponential, and that's why you can see videos of Elon Musk talking about robo-taxis by next year, because there's just much more signal and much more data to work with to vastly improve the performance of the car, not just autonomous driving. When we implement, so there are 9,200 manufacturers, there's 920 dots on the screen, you'll have to trust me on that. Each dot is 10 manufacturers. When we implement technology as human beings, or when we implement talent strategies, the result, if you look in the upper left-hand corner, looks something like that. And that's it, except that's 10 companies, so it really looks like that. And then we all do this individually. We don't collaborate. We want to play this close to the vest, and you'll see green, yellow, and red bursts up there because business outcomes vary. Not every project works out. But in the end, 100 companies have done something, and there's no real impact. No real regional impact. There's no impact in an industry because sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't. And there's no closed loop on the data. And there's no aggregation point for the data. And there's no working together to go faster. Instead, we're just trying to monetize every aspect of every project. We're trying to minimize the cost. And we play it close to the vest because we don't want anybody to know that we failed at something because we compete that way. But there is a different way. We need to reimagine, not just using AI, but technologies in general, including people and people with intelligent technologies, the way that we work together. This decade will not be about the largest companies winning. It will be about the companies that are best able to collaborate, to find efficiencies, and best able to adapt to those technologies. Just bear in mind all of the technologies that are coming. If even my slide where all those lines went vertical, which is not a true representation of market adoption, but it just represents how many things are going to be available to consider investing in, that was 5% of the actual prediction. Let's say you don't believe that slide, you only believe 10% of my 5%. The technology is here. It's coming. Intelligent technologies are here. They are being adopted at scale by the largest, fastest growing companies in the world. It's not going back in the box. At this point, the progress, it's really just about whether it's going to happen by you and with you and for you, or if it's going to happen to you. And this is where attrition is going to occur and competitive balance will fall, is around your ability to adapt to what's out there. This is true in education as well. It's not just industry. I'm part of the steering committee for the Higher Education Regional Alliance. It will be announced publicly. I think it's been in the news a little bit, but there's an event on October 15th where all 18 schools in the region, which represent more than 150,000 college students, the chancellors and presidents of those schools, myself and 8 other organizations are part of the steering committee. They're all PhDs. I speak every 4th meeting, meaning I say something every 4th meeting. But you know, here's a quote from the Journal Sentinel, I think this week. It's Mike Lovell from Marquette University. You could talk to any one of the heads of these schools, and they will tell you that they do not know if they will be around 10 years from now unless they change dramatically. Birth rates are way down. We're living in the age of the gilded age of stacked certificates and credentialing rather than the value placed on 4-year and master's degrees and PhDs. This is about continuous lifelong learning, the model of go to school for 4 or 6 or 8 years, get a job, work, retire. That's dead. This is now about work, learn, work, learn, work, learn. And so I will say that having been a volunteer member of many committees, like I'm sure we all have been, in economic development and so forth throughout our careers, there is amazing work getting done, not necessarily at the steering committee level, because nothing ever happens there, but in the work groups as it relates to the schools, finding ways to leverage assets, shared assets, joint nursing centers, all sorts of shared facilities, shared instructors, shared teachers and professors, shared curriculum, shared content, articulation agreements between the schools. It's incredible the amount of work that's gotten done behind the scenes in the last 12 months or so, and much of it will become public on the 15th of October. But as it relates to business, I believe one significant strategic answer is ecosystems. And I'm not the only one. Ecosystems, every one of the logos up on the screen speaks to the value of ecosystems today. And I want to take some of the buzzword out of it and help you understand a little bit about why. This is Reid Hoffman of PayPal and then LinkedIn, among other things, blitzscaling. 7 of the world's 12 largest companies by market capitalization today are a function of digital ecosystems. Okay? And they were very purposeful in building them. One of the more widely recognized ecosystems is Apple's. You can note that since the iPod, it's not like they produced all of the music. They partnered with the music publishers. They partnered with authors and book publishers. They partnered with the app developers. It was the App Store that really gave, that platform that really gave the iPhone the engine it needed to go. I know that SWICKtech is working on something similar in terms of a platform approach, an app store approach for the enterprise. These are the sorts of ecosystems, you know, the more recent ones with Apple News and TV Plus and the new Apple Card in partnership with Goldman Sachs. They don't do it on their own. They find partners. They curate partners. Okay? Here's another example. This was at the Retreat Center. That's the head of autonomous vehicles for Illinois. And the slide that he has up is Tesla. When you buy a Tesla, you don't buy a car, he said, you buy a system. You know, the GPS helps you easily find superchargers and that whole network, and there's many baked-in services, and that's a function of an ecosystem. Tesla doesn't own all of that. Survival in today's economy is not about the largest companies, it's about adaptability. We need propulsion and adaptability in our businesses. And when we look at some of the predictions around the power of ecosystems, McKinsey talks about 30% of global revenue in just 5 or 6 years coming from ecosystems. $60 trillion. That ties into what Accenture talks about, $100 trillion by 2030. 3 out of 4 CEOs realize, this is an Accenture survey of CEOs, 1,250 CEOs, that their current business model will be unrecognizable in 5 years, and that the primary change agent will be, one of the primary change agents will be ecosystems. 5 out of 6 talk about ecosystems are an important part of their strategy. Every industry, 5 out of 8 ecosystems will disrupt. This is latest stuff from Deloitte, talking about all of the opportunities that can be achieved in business ecosystems. Okay, so what is an ecosystem? An ecosystem is a group of cross-industry partners working together to bring value-added solutions to market, to solve real problems, to turn problems into opportunities. One of the things that I've spun up in the last 7 months now is TenX Manufacturing, which is, I built the frameworks by which all manufacturers and service providers qualified to do business with Foxconn. And so that methodology helped me pare what was 600 companies down to 118 companies, and those are the 118 that I put forward as high performers in the state. After that, Foxconn met with all 118 at least once, oftentimes multiple. They did about 60 site visits. This is D Group, which is focused on servers and desktops. And they came back to me and said, the result of those 60 site visits is that on average, the high-performing manufacturers that you presented to us are 10 to 15 years behind our strategic suppliers in Asia. That's a really loaded statement, and at first, my defense mechanisms went up, and it felt like a little bit of an indictment of process, but in the end, they are the highest performing manufacturers in Wisconsin, and it doesn't take 10 years to close a 10-year gap. But it's clear that from a cybersecurity and automation, a scalability, data analytics, and the types of transparency, multi-tier supplier transparency that is required by the largest companies, not just Foxconn. Every large OEM, discrete manufacturer in the world is looking for greater transparency. You could see some of that in the Lighthouse data. So what we did was we decided to go help solve the gap. And it doesn't have to be as difficult as it first seems. So we formed 6 stakeholders. We identified 6 stakeholders. I lost a font, but I think you can still read it. Strategic manufacturers, so not just Foxconn, but others. The component suppliers, the solution providers, technology companies, early stage companies with product market fit for manufacturing, and the institutions of higher education, especially when it comes to talent. This is a Deloitte piece of data, but as you are curating ecosystem partners, you group them into categories. What Pentio Group does is we're an ecosystem producer, so I'm not asking everybody to join TenX Manufacturing. I was in Green Bay again yesterday helping the new Manufacturing Alliance spin up an ecosystem approach for their 183 members, manufacturing members. This is about workflow. It's about an ecosystem approach. It's not about one entity. It's not a membership group that everybody should join. It's a function of spinning up as many ecosystems as possible and then bringing those ecosystems together. So whether it's a company or a region, we help create those ecosystems by curating. There are best practices already in place in terms of what it takes to measure somebody's willingness and ability to collaborate. You want to start with scalable companies. We're not trying to save 9,200 companies. There would be a lot of wasted energy there. But we want to create business cases out of the highest performing companies, those that are most willing to invest in these technologies, those that have declared themselves innovators and early adopters, and surround them with experts. I think I can show you something that speaks directly to that. Today, the ecosystem looks a little bit like this as you start to build out the branches of each stakeholder group. We turn wicked problems into wicked opportunities, and those opportunities that we focus on are threefold. One is around talent gap, because it's the first and second priority for every company today, especially given the shortage and all of the disruption that we just talked about. Industry X.0, because we're very near 5.0 at this point, and so given the speed of innovation, left of the integer doesn't really matter. So we just think about world-class solutions. So we curate solution providers that perform at a really high level. Eric, what's your rolling 30 on Net Promoter Score? Okay, so world-class companies, what's happened? Sorry. You've been as high as 80 on a 30-day rolling average, right? And great companies are a 50 on Net Promoter. So there's 4 quadrants to the curation system. One is around, it's very traditional, sourcing information around manufacturing, engineering, and quality control. The next is an external perspective on how they perform from a customer's perspective. We go out and get that data. In SWICKtech's case, as they focused on that metric, it has reached into the 70s. 70 is a world-class score. You want to find world-class partners. When you find world-class solution providers, or even great ones, if you're in the 50s and 60s, and we have other partners in the room like Selig Leasing is here, and Vantage Financial is here, and ADP is one of our partners. They increase the probability of positive business outcomes, okay? So by doing that, we're able to work on things together, because capability maturity, which is a model, runs 1 to 5. And given this is an advanced data analytics model, but all of us, let's assume we just went 1 through 5 around the table, and I sat down with Steve Schaefer, and Steve's a 4 and I'm a 1. I'm paying for lunch because Steve's been where I need to get to, right? And Steve can add a lot of value. And then Isaac is a 3, and I can still learn from Isaac. And we can have great conversations, and we can even convene a group this size and do breakouts like we're going to do today and learn and go back to the office and feel great about the day. But we can't really work together. We can't really do things together and get things done together. But if you pair up 1s and 2s and try to get them to a 3, and you surround them with world-class partners so that you increase the probability of positive business outcomes, you can actually create an ecosystem that is focused on delivering solutions. And then when you create closed-loop data, which is an absolute requirement in an ecosystem approach, you can iterate. And you can leverage a methodology, and I'm wrapping up, Nicole. You can leverage, how many of you have heard of minimum viable product, lean startup? Lots of hands. How many of you have heard of minimum viable transformation? I hadn't either until a couple of weeks ago. MVT helps you see the vision, if you're a 1, of what a 4 might look like and the impact it could have on your business. But it's very difficult to leapfrog. Maybe some would say impossible to leapfrog stages. You can employ level 4 and 5 tools to accelerate through these stages. But if I can see what a 4 looks like, and I can use the data from other companies who have gone through it to understand what the business intended and actual business outcomes are, and I can go from a 1 to a 2 to a 3, and I can gauge for my business if that investment makes sense, you can actually organize the work to get done in a much more efficient way. We have a tendency to walk in the door selling a 4 to a 1, and that's your 12-month sales cycle that dies on the vine. The goal here is to help companies understand that it doesn't have to be a mystery, that there is a path, that the path can be achieved, that you probably will have a higher success rate of business outcomes if you measure, instead of depend on intuition and personal references only, they have value too, to choose your supplier. And in the end, you can create these 90-day paths where you educate and prioritize and prototype and learn. And you create this feedback cycle to help people learn how to do things together faster, because when we work together, we can actually pace ourselves with the technology and make a lot more smaller bets and sort of sprinkle the board, given that we're in a casino, in terms of where, you know, instead of spending, I want to give one anecdote and I'll be done. It's 45 seconds-ish. I know of a great company in town. They have around 500 employees. And last October, a year ago, they decided to implement Industry 4.0, whatever that meant, during a 2-day management offsite. In 2019, they were ready to make investments instead of just talking about it. And so they brought consultants in. And one large consultant came in, and the scope of work was a 2-day management workshop and a prioritization. Outcome of the management workshop is everybody's aligned, we have some ideas, prioritization helps us choose a top 3 because you can't do 20 things in a year. And the cost of that workshop was $150,000. Yeah, and so, or you could buy a press and make more money, right? And so they went to the next consultant, and the consultant, same scope, said $60,000, which is 60% less. And that's pretty good. And they went to a third consultant, he said, it's $4,000 for the workshop, but we'll credit the $4K against the $15,000 prioritization. We think it's 15 all in. So is it 15 or 60 or 150? It's the same scope. So what door do you choose? 15, 60, or 150? Where do you go? Where does your mind go? Shout out numbers. A lot of people say middle. So they went door number 3, and they have no complaints about how things were delivered with that vendor. None. I was at a Pat Benatar concert in July at Gathering on the Green with these guys, and they were still going through prioritization 9 months later. And now 2019 objectives were 2020 objectives. And the system 1 response in your brain is, should have gone middle. But you could get the same outcome in 15, 60, or 150. Instead, what you can do is find that core partner who you trust, which might be the 15. Doesn't matter what you spend. Nobody's bringing all of the expertise for those 12 technologies to the table. And we can surround them with qualified, vetted partners. Many of you could be those partners. And you can actually have the expertise in the room. And maybe you spend 100 or 120, 150. But you bring 10 companies to the table who are starting from the same starting point. And you help them understand how they grow. And now you have diversity of thought. And you have multiple outcomes. And like Tesla, you have a lot more data to work with, instead of keeping it all close to the vest. And that's the ecosystem approach. And the good news is, while I have to stop talking now, there's roundtables available, so we can keep talking later on. I appreciate your time. Thank you.